Let's begin. So, you are here for the Flowing Fears Signature Workshop. And again, I'm so grateful for everybody who registered and signed up and all the lovely people who are supporting me. And also, I'm just inviting all of us together as we come together from different places all over the country and in different countries. And just that we are here in this moment together, acknowledging and honoring the lands that we walk on. And I'm trusting that we all walk with a lot of reverence and respect for this beautiful earth that holds us so dearly. So, welcome to everybody. I'm just going to invite us to take a moment to breathe and bring ourselves into attention and connection, even though we can't see each other. I'm just going to invite us to bring our intention internal, eyes open or eyes closed, if that feels right for you. And just locate your breath in your body. So, just taking a moment to find your breath and rest your attention on your breath, noticing where your breath is, noticing the quality of your breath, and just holding that attention for 3 breaths. And if it feels right, holding an intention for the next hour. And then coming back together. I'm just going to light this candle just as an offering and a ritual to be present for the remaining of our time together. Okay, so moving on, moving up into our head now. Today we are going to explore the following. Going to open with the question about why psychedelics. And then we're going to talk a bit about integration and preparation to set the foundation of what I'm about to share with you. I'm going to talk a bit about holding patterns and resistance and how that shows up in our system. And then we'll move into an explanation of the flowing fears process, including an outline of the phases and steps. And then I'll talk about some next steps, and we'll have time for Q&A, hopefully. And then, as I mentioned, we'll follow up with the live heart seat offer. So first of all, why do clients seek out psychedelics? We know that there's a few reasons why people are interested in engaging with the mind-altering substances that we call psychedelics. And some of us reach out for the support to heal trauma or to improve mental health, to find meaning or sense making, or to deepen our connection to the mystical realms. Or some of us engage with psychedelics for pleasure and recreation. And I'm curious if you've noticed that sometimes clients experience a shift after psychedelic sessions, only return to what I call a familiar way of being. And so the reason why I think this happens is because psychedelics can act as an initiating catalyst, or what we can call as an ordeal. And the ordeal, which is a challenging situation, works as a catalyst for change. However, change requires that we do something different when the familiar shows up, and that we embody this new state of being. So, similar to all initiatory experiences, such as childbirth, or, for example, receiving a diagnosis or experiencing an extreme illness or a sudden shift in identity, or accidents, or experiencing a loss or death, or a marriage or a divorce, or even things like fasting or extreme fasting, or ceremonial or ritual events such as sun dancing or vision questing, or sweat lodges, or facing anything really that is experienced as something extremely challenging that pushes us to our edge. Let's call that an ordeal. And as with all initiating experiences, it doesn't necessarily mean that change will occur, but the catalyst is there for change to occur. And it also doesn't necessarily mean that the ordeal will be embodied as traumatic. So, based on that map, the point of view that I hold as a lens is that transformational change happens when we do something different the next time the familiar shows up. So, for example, we take the lessons from the psychedelic experiences, we integrate them, we apply them into our lives through action so that change can occur. And this has left me to hold the question, well, what if nothing changes? What is the point of psychedelic assisted therapy? If nothing changes for the client, if they keep returning to the familiar patterns of their day to day life, or if they keep struggling with the traumas or the mental distress that they came in hoping to alleviate the symptoms of, what's the point of psychedelic assisted therapy? So it might be true that the client is probably having deep insights and maybe even enjoying the view, so to speak. However, embodying the wisdom of the teachings that are coming through the medicine is key. And this is where we come in as guides or therapists. And this is what the Flowing Fears process can help to facilitate. But before we jump in, I'd like to explain, or I'm sorry, before we jump in explaining the process, I want to hear from each of you and explore the concept of integration. So, first of all, what is your why? Go ahead. You can answer these questions and pop them in the chat, and I will read them out loud. So I'll read what these questions are for those of you who might not be seeing the slides. Why are you a guide or therapist? Why do you want to be of service as a guide? Do you have any reservations, hesitations, or concerns? And if you're not currently acting as a psychedelic guide or therapist, why are you here? And what kinds of questions do you hold, or reservations, hesitations, or concerns maybe you might have towards the use of psychedelics? So go ahead, and if you want to answer those questions, you can pop them in the chat. Thank you. So Eugenia, you said you want to hold space for transformation. Thank you. I believe psychedelic therapy has the potential to allow deep healing that may not be possible for people through other routes. Thank you. I'm here to expand my knowledge beyond recreational use and microdosing personally. Thank you. I'm a guide to support folks in the liminal spaces of life, the transitions faced throughout the lifespan, including psychedelic space, as folks seek healing from within. Thank you. Give back what was given to me, becoming functional. Thank you. I'm a journeyer and may consider guiding at some point as a healer and around many who are integrating experiences, so I am wanting to learn about the process. Thank you. Yeah, this is fun. I feel called to do what I can in this space to support the work. Curiosity about how psychedelics can interrupt loops and patterns, expansive quality. Yay. I think psychedelics massively accelerate the healing journey. Wonderful. Nice to see you all here. I'm going to pop back over to my screen and keep going. So, what is your why? So, moving on. So, let's talk about integration because this is the hot topic, and we need to understand preparation and integration um, before we talk about how the flowing fears process can support that. So I really like this quote. For those of you who haven't read Rachel Harris's book yet, Swimming in the Sacred, I recommend you do. And in there, there's a lot of definitions of integration, but I really aligned with this one, which is as our inner space expands, we open up to new ways of being. Perhaps we can embrace our polarities with more grace and less projection of blame, or become kinder and more forgiving about our own frailties and failures. I'd rather not talk about integration as a term, but instead consider lifelong learning about how to be human, how to inhabit our bodies, how to realize our interconnectedness. It's kind of funny because I realized in this slide, learning is spelt, has a mistaken spelling, which comes right after how to be human. So I really appreciate that. Just recognizing that we're so human and we make mistakes like spelling. So mine is how I define integration is to bring it from the ethers, so to speak. So to take the bits of information that we've collected from the ethers and from our mind and to bring them into our body and our heart system and then to make sense out of them. So I'm just going to invite you all to take a moment to consider the term integration. If you want, you can pop some ideas in the chat, but you don't have to. I just want you to consider the idea of integration. You might hear it a lot and curious what your experiences have been with it, what you've learned about it or haven't learned about it. If you think it's important or if you think that it's just something that we're focusing on right now. So, moving on, these are some ideas that are meaningful to me that come out of more of a nervous system informed lens and an attachment theory lens about what I think are core requirements, meaning foundational to effective integration. So, first of all, there needs to be a neuroception of safety, which means that your nervous system and your body system and your heart system needs to be able to experience a sense of calm and connection. Also, I believe that integration requires co regulation, which is the act of regulating with another nervous system so that we're not doing this on our own. And it's said that the strongest, or I should say, the more anchored nervous system in the space holds the space. So, as a guide and a therapist, I believe it's our responsibility to be that anchored nervous system. It's important that as the client and the guide, that we remain embodied, that we bring the gift of presence and openness. And I would add to that like flexibility as well and curiosity of mind. So I see those as foundational to support the integration process itself. So, taking from Rachel Harris's book again, Swimming in the Sacred, she kind of outlines a few what I would call phases of integration that include things like a sharing circle. So I think many of us have probably experienced that post psychedelic session or event, or I don't know if I'd call it an event, a retreat maybe. Um, Also, body work and energy work are incredibly supportive for integration, meaning making, creative expression, and shadow work. So I've made a list here of some modalities that can support these five different, you might want to call them phases of integration. And I'm just curious if any of you have any ideas about modalities or methods that you use or you would like to use or um, you bring to integration. If you want to pop that into the chat, I'll read those and then I'll kind of follow up with the ones I wrote. Breath work, yes, indeed. And also here, Shahad said, for me, integration has been about taking the tools learned in the ceremony and adapting them to all areas of my life. Exactly. Thank you for sharing that. Jana said, life is one long integration session, author unknown. That's great. Sometimes it feels like trying to grasp the wind. Anybody else have ideas about modalities or methods to help with integration? Writing, journaling. I think integration is an essential step in embodying of the insights from a journey. It can be conscious or unconscious at the level of the mind or at the level of the body. The level of the body seems the most meaningful as it unfolds organically rather than forced. Yes, thank you for saying that. Walking, dance, movement. Anybody else? Being in ceremony, play, wonderful. Noreen, can you elaborate on what you mean by being in ceremony as a form, like as a tool for integration? Sweat Lodge. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I love it. These are all wonderful methods and ways in which we can access deeper integration. And I added a few as well, such as energy work or body therapies, expressive art therapies, singing, creating music, meditation, psychotherapy, acupuncture, nature, water, and ritual. I also wrote ceremony, Noreen. So those were just some ideas that I had. And as you can see, we all know that there are a lot of different ways in which we can access support for deeper integration. So let's talk a bit about what blocks integration. Here are some ideas that have come up for me, and I'm curious if you all have anything to add to this. I believe that when there's a lack of relational safety between the sitter and the space holder and the journeyer, for example, or the client and the therapist, for example, that can be a block for deeper integration. If there's ineffective anchoring within the space, both with the individual and and within the collective environmental space, if the individual's stuck in survival stress, if there's ignorance or they're unmotivated, and I don't mean that in a slandering way, I mean it more that they didn't know that integration is an important part of the process, or some people aren't motivated for integration. Some people really would prefer to have the recreational experience and not necessarily bring it into the conscious view. or if the client is rigid or there's a lot of constriction or resistance. And so we're going to talk about that today. Would you add anything to this list? Unsupportive home environment. And that would go with the lack of relational safety, but absolutely. Maybe blocked due to imbalance in personal self care, lack of time, lack of self awareness. Indeed. So the lack of self awareness kind of aligns with the ignorance or unmotivated piece. Lack of access to integrative supports, inadequate preparation. Yes, all very wonderful additions. Thank you. And Kate, we're actually going to talk about preparation for this exact reason. So thank you for bringing that up. So let's move on. So, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We've probably heard this before, and I actually had to look it up to see who said this quote, but it was Benjamin Franklin in 1736. So, what do we mean by this? We mean that preparation not only builds relational safety, but it offers context. Context is calming to the alarm system. So, when I say context, I mean information gathering. So, as for example, Joe Dispenza, he would often say information is the precursor to transformation. So, the more a client feels relationally safe, environmentally safe, and physically safe, the more apt they are at surrendering to the experience and opening to integration afterwards. For some, though, one preparation session is just not enough, which seems to be the common these days if there's even a preparation session. It's not enough to prepare their nervous system, heart system, and mind system to let go while in a non ordinary state. Now, I understand the word let go can be very activating for some people, so can the word surrender. But the idea being that we want to be able to release the resistance to the experience itself. So, this brings us to a challenge that we face within the context of our Western dominant culture. So, something about the idea of the psychedelic renaissance really gets me thinking in relation to indigenous ways of knowing. And I can't go into this in depth in today's presentation, but I felt it was important to make the point. We know that Western culture is a culture of separation, competition, and dominance. And that the problem with the West is that we need integration as an overt practice. And I'm going to explain why. Because for many of us, we are born into this Western culture. We have not been part of a community of relational safety and security, connection, and ceremony in which non ordinary states of consciousness are embraced and woven into the fabric of our social settings. We would call that an attachment culture, not a culture of separation. And I call the fact that many of us are born into a culture of separation one of the great burdens that we bear. And so there's a lot, like I said, I want to say about this tension, but for today, I just want to name it. So, because of this primordial trauma, the trauma of separation, due to the horrendous acts that have been committed in the name of Western culture, we have to consider the need for active preparation and integration to contribute towards safe psychedelic containers. So, for example, as much as I wanted to run away from dominant culture and find a community of attachment that I could rest into and be reborn into, I keep being reminded on numerous occasions that my work is here within the trauma and mess of dominant culture. So, all of this to say that preparation as prevention is as important of a topic of conversation as integration. I actually want to share a story about this before I move on. because it's a really heavy topic. And one of my very first experiences with psychedelic medicines, plant medicines, was when I was living in Mexico and I was doing a midwifery apprenticeship at the time. So we're talking 18 years ago, no, 17 years ago now. And during that time, I was introduced to many different traveling shamans. And we were living on a piece of property that happened to be the ceremonial lands where all of these different shamans would come through and offer ceremony. And after one ceremony in particular with the medicine called yopo, I felt so moved to follow the shaman that the next day I had the shaman over for dinner and I prepared this dinner and I was watching myself prepare food for this medicine man that I had just met. And I was almost doting on this person in service in a way that I had never done even for my husband. And at this time, I was a mother of three children, three young children, and we were living in Mexico and things were wild and beautiful. And I had such a strong pull to want to go back to the jungle to be of service and learn and apprentice from this man and literally leave my family. And here's an example of maybe not great integration after a ceremony that blew me open. And so thankfully, about 24 hours later, I had a moment with myself where I heard, Jennifer, your work is here with your children, that your medicine work is to be a mother, not to leave your family. And I had all the excuses in my mind running, like why do all the great, visionaries and all the great mystical leaders, why are they all men? And why do they get to go off and 40 days into the night or something like that? I was feeling all of this frustration, and I couldn't believe that I was overwhelmed with a desire to almost want to run to the jungle, but run away from my family. And thankfully I had that wake up moment and I turned towards motherhood as medicine. And that has been my path for the last 17 years. And now my children are adults, so I have more time where I could go to the jungle. But anyways, I kind of wanted to share that. There's more I'd like to say as it relates to this story of attachment culture and separation culture. Okay, moving on. So what you resist persists. So psychedelics, based on what I've shared so far, psychedelics act as a catalyst for change, and they create the ordeal, that kind of situation in which they can magnify what the client is resisting or incapable of seeing or feeling in their consensus reality. So when resistance shows up, which it generally does, one can either relax into the resistance or push back against it, resulting in constriction, incoherence, and rigidity. So typically, when there's a lot of resistance, this results in what we might call a bad trip or a client who experience it as having been traumatic or injurious. On the lighter side, they might just never return to psychedelics because it wasn't enjoyable or they didn't even have an expanded journey. But I want to talk about resistance itself. So, first of all, what are they resisting? Generally speaking, they, including we, are resisting the emotional material. So we're resisting feeling the feelings, we're resisting feeling the emotions or moving the emotional material as it shows up, as it presents itself. We're resisting the felt sensations. So I remember it took me a really long time to completely let go to the medicine journey of psilocybin. And my whole felt system, my whole embodiment system for years would fight it because I didn't want to feel the sensations because I was afraid that I was literally going to be blown into a million little pieces. So that's an example of being resisting to the felt sensations. We just don't want to feel what's happening within our body system. Then we also resist the mental cognitions. So we resist hearing the stories. And since psychedelics magnify everything, those stories can become very loud, especially if they're negative stories that are looping. That can become very challenging. And so then we build resistance towards that. And we can resist the images. So seeing the inner movie, the mind movie, as I call it, not wanting to look at it. So there's a lot of areas here in which we can develop a lot of resistance. So resistance triggers our alarm system, which is our survival system, which is connected to our sympathetic system. So resistance triggers our alarm system, which triggers fear. And fear triggers our alarm system, which triggers resistance. We know that resistance prevents the change from happening, and this creates a loop. And I call this loop the holding pattern. So, very simple, like an airplane circling the sky without landing. We've all heard of that term, the holding pattern, and maintaining a certain familiar pattern in our life. So, that certain familiar pattern, as it repeats itself, is what I call the holding pattern. And this pattern shows up in how you think, feel, and behave, basically resulting in the same shit, different day kind of scenario, to put it lightly. Ultimately, we want to be able to shift out of those holding patterns. And sometimes this is why we turn towards psychedelic medicines, is for it to maybe break that catalyst, for it to break that holding pattern. Sorry, that's loud. So the system will shift into protective patterns when it's overwhelmed or flooded by too much survival stress. And we know that prolonged survival stress is basically being in a trapped fear response, and that as a human or as any organism that has a nervous system, we're not intended to be in a prolonged survival stress state. That is usually leads to what we would call dis-ease. So I think, let me just see here. I'm reading my notes. Yes. So basically, we're in this trapped state. We're like resisting life itself when we're in a survival stress state. The system is then trapped in this state of alarm. We go into sympathetic overdrive, or for those of you who know the polyvagal system, we drop into dorsal collapse. And when we're stuck in the cycle of fear and resistance, as I said, otherwise known as the holding pattern, this produces the release of a chemical cocktail of survival stress hormones, such as catecholamines, including the neurotransmitters of dopamine, epinephrine, which is adrenaline, norepinephrine, which we all know are part of our sympathetic system. And those hormones and neurotransmitters are actually meant to mobilize our body system to be able to get out of the state that we're in. You could imagine that if we're under the influence of a psychedelic and we can't get out of that state, but our system is flooded with survival stress, this cocktail of survival stress hormones, that's a recipe for an injurious experience. So we want to know either what can we do preventatively or post ceremony to help to discharge that nervous system from that survival stress state. I also want to say that cortisol is part of this cocktail, but it comes in as the brakes. So when the system is flooded, that's annoying. When the system is flooded with all of this stress hormone, cortisol comes in and it's like, whoa, mayday, 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 we got to slow this down. And so it tries to apply the brakes. So then now our system is flooded with cortisol. For those of you who want to geek out on this from a neuroscience point of view, that sudden rush of cortisol, if that remains trapped in our system and it doesn't get to discharge, meaning it doesn't get to move out of the system to complete that survival stress response, it's actually going to shut down or reduce function of certain parts of our brain, in particular the hippocampus, which is really important because that part of our brain is responsible for taking that highly charged emotional state and storing it as episodic memory. In other words, that part of our brain helps us make sense out of what is happening. So I think it's really important that we look at reducing survival stress symptoms before, during, and after a psychedelic therapeutic session. Moving on. So how do these protective patterns show up? For those of you who have worked with me, you'll have heard me say this before, but these protective patterns show up as either popping out, shutting down, exploding, or imploding. It's a very simple way of basically describing what the nervous system is doing when it's in that state of resistance, developing prolonged survival stress, needing an outlet to move that stuck energetic material. They are protective patterns, meaning that they've worked to keep our system alive. So, popping out, for example, is akin to dissociating. Shutting down would be numbing out, exploding, projecting onto another, yelling, even hurting or doing harmful behaviors. Imploding is yelling at oneself. So that loud inner critic, self harm, negative cognitions, for example. So this leads us to the question of how and when do we help our clients shift states? How do we recognize this? What can we do to ensure that the client's nervous system is well supported pre, during, and post psychedelic sessions? I just need to take a sip of my tea. So it's led me to some ethical questions, actually, that I don't have answers for, or have some ideas about. And I just thought I would pose them here, not that we have time to kind of digest them together, but I am curious what you all think about that. So, if psychedelics can trigger these protective patterns in our clients, you know, beforehand, during, or post session, then the question is, if a client is in a state of resistance or fear prior to the psychedelic session, and you notice this and that their protective patterns are emerging, is it ethical to move forward with that client and admit like for a psychedelic experience? So should we be moving forward, or should we spend way more time in that preparation phase? Or if a client resists what is arising during a psychedelic session, how do their protective patterns show up and how do we respond? So I think typically those of us who are working as guides or have taken some training as a psychedelic assisted therapist, we spend a lot of time on maybe how we would show up during and post. And I'm just going to invite us to really think about that preparation phase. And then I'm also curious what your thoughts are on high dose psychedelics, which typically a high dose psychedelic kind of blows through what I call the gatekeeper. So those protective patterns, it's like it blows through the part of our system, the inner part of our system that is functioning as the gatekeeper to keep us safe. And so in a high dose psychedelic, the idea is to get past that. But then my question again is that ethical if it's going to produce a lot of sympathetic or survival stress symptoms? Okay, moving on. So let's just pause for a moment. I'm going to jump over to the chat here because it's been a while since I've looked. Curious how everybody's doing. Any questions, comments so far? Thumbs up if you're appreciating what you're learning, if it's making sense so far. Thank you. Yay. Yeah, it's really weird talking to yourself in these webinars. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate that. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. We are moving towards the introduction of the flowing fears process that hopefully will make sense to all of you by the time we get there. But first of all, so what I've noticed in the work that I've done as a therapist is that most of my clients come to me saying that they're afraid to feel. They're afraid to feel too much. And what I have noticed in supporting a small amount of psychedelic clients, so this is not an area where I have a ton of experience as a support person, I have my own personal experience with, is that generally that fear of feeling too much is what shows up in the session and usually prevents the client from going beyond that edge. And so, what we're often working with is building capacity, confidence, and tolerance to be okay with what shows up in the moment that it's showing up, to know that it's safe enough to feel what I'm feeling in that moment. It's safe enough to see what I'm seeing in that moment. It's safe enough to hear what I'm hearing in that moment. So the more that we have that sense of, again, relational, environmental, physical, mental, emotional safety, the more apt we are to completely, again, surrender to the experience that's unfolding, which is the magic of the psychedelic. So, if we go back to the metaphor that I was using with the holding pattern in the airplanes, the question is, well, how do we break the pattern? And the idea being that, well, we can run out of gas and crash land, which I call a crisis. So, it's like the pattern's going, 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 going. I'm sure many of us can relate to this in our own lives, or maybe we've seen it within our clients' lives. And then something happens. Again, it's like a catalyst that happens, but it's more coming at it from a negative advantage point versus a positive ordeal, right? So we end up in a state of crisis and we're like, how am I here again? So I call that crash landing. Or we can do something different when the familiar shows up for a safe landing, which really is about preparation, regulation, and anchoring. So let's move on. The idea being that we would love to be able to support our clients, or for those of you who are interested in the use of psychedelics and not interested in becoming a guide, you probably also would love for those experiences to provide you with some kind of transformative change. And yes, the word transformation is used all over the place. So it doesn't necessarily mean anything when we hear it all the time. But what I mean by transformational change is that we and the people within our environment can see and feel a qualitative difference in our state of being. And I just would like to say that really it's that our heart is opening and that we're starting to move away from living in that sympathetic survival state and we're moving towards living in a heart-based way of being. So that's how I see transformative change. And this is where the flowing fears process comes in and why I want to share it with all of you because I see it as a modality or as a tool that many of us can carry along with our other modalities and tools that we use to really support that opportunity for transformative change as well as to help with that preparation phase. So we're going to unpack this. Feel a little bit like I'm running a marathon. Okay, we have about 10 more minutes left and we'll see how this goes. So first of all, how did this process come through me, come to me? And initially, I didn't call it the flowing fears process. Initially, it actually was a step-by-step experience that I was guided internally to do because I had come up against what I call another trauma tornado experience in my life. So, for example, I had been doing a lot of trauma healing work on myself and including regular EMDR. At one point, I was doing 3 times a week of EMDR. And so I was working really hard to unhook from some complex trauma. And I felt like I was finally getting back into life. And I say I was at this phase of my life where I got my brain back, meaning that prior to that, what was happening within my brain was a lot of distress, but a lot of malfiring that was going on. So quick to anger, couldn't really articulate what I was thinking, having a really hard time holding multiple ideas. Multitasking was hard, driving was hard. Um, I would just often feel a lot of frustration, and I knew that my brain wasn't functioning well because I had a very hard time maintaining even a conversation. There's no way I could have put this together and presented it to all of you at that phase of my life. So I was at a point in my life where I was starting to really recover and get back into life, and I actually was presenting to a group of professionals about trauma-informed birth care. And during that first kind of touch point where I went back into the world and I was speaking to over 20 different birth professionals. And one person had asked me a question, and that question really threw me and it started a spiral. And I noticed myself spiraling, but I knew I couldn't allow myself to become undone in the public space that I was in. So I kind of like tucked it away, but it was at the end of the presentation, so I was able to quickly hurry up, close things up, and then I got home. And I remember when I walked in the door, I everything closed in on me. And this is what can happen to us when we're flooded with sympathetic and survival stress and traumatic stress material. It just kind of flooded in on me. And the room started to get small, and even when I think back on it now, it was like gray. Everything was gray. It was like there were no lights on. And I had worked so hard to quiet my inner voice that was very suicidal for many years. And so that voice had been very quiet, but it was loud. It got activated, and I was starting to hear those suicidal ideations again. And my children weren't there. My husband was there, and I remember him being in a distance, and he was looking at me, and he couldn't figure out what was wrong, and I couldn't really articulate what was going on. I knew that I was spiraling, and this is what I call a trauma spiral, where you're just flooded with everything again, and you work so hard, and then you come back here again. And at this time, I had just finished teaching about the neuroscience of trauma, the nervous system stuff. It's like all this information, and I felt like the greatest imposter. And and so all this was closing in on me, and I bridged myself on the countertop. That again, everything was gray and quiet, and it kind of felt like you were swimming in the deep end. And I heard this voice. And so, in competition with the suicidal ideations and the darkness and the inner critic and everything that was just taking me down and dropping me into the basement of that almost dorsal collapse state, I heard, Jennifer, you know what to do, and you need to do something different. And that voice that I heard, I wanted to fight it because I knew what they meant. And in that moment, I was hearing myself talking what I had just been teaching about flipping the lid and Dan Siegel's work on needing to like bring the prefrontal cortex back online because that allows us to be able to downregulate and also self-reflect. It brings our executive function back. And so I heard this, you need to do something different. You know what to do. And I didn't want to do something different. So this is what I call choice point. Sometimes when we're hit by those triggers and those activations, and I'll talk a bit about this later, but when you're hit by that, you really want to go down the neuronal pathway that you know. It's that super highway. It's so well carved out. You're so comfortable there. You know where it's going to take you. It's the familiar past. And so when we're at that edge, there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of resistance. And I knew this time I had to address it differently by bringing in the knowledge that I had to engage it. And I really didn't want to. So there was a tug of war happening inside. I knew I could go down into the dungeon and that would be comfortable. Even though it's incredibly uncomfortable, there's an odd comfort to the familiar place. But I decided to try something different. And what unfolded are these next 10 steps. And so I wrote them down. This process ended up taking me only about 30 minutes. It was quite fast once I shifted my attention towards this something different. And I paid very close attention to everything that was happening and what I was doing in each step and how I brought in all of my learnings and teachings in that moment, and how it actually kind of kicked me out the other side, in which I shifted state from this trauma spiral, which is your survival stress state, to my more ventral vagal, calm, connected, restored place. And that all happened within 30 minutes. My husband watched this. He didn't do anything. He was just kind of standing there. And I, was kind of talking to myself and then journaling and then doing this whole thing. So I'm going to explain to you what it is. So first of all, the flowing fears process, it will walk your client through an embodied journey of inner investigation. So it really requires that initial shift from that outer world to your inner environment. And the purpose of it is to release trapped survival emotion. So to digest and metabolize what I call your survival emotions, which, by the way, are anger, fear, or despair. To identify our core limiting beliefs, to restore and heal our lost soul parts. So there's a whole inner parts piece here, so that we can let go of these holding patterns and then we can embrace the change that we seek. So that's kind of the idea. I call it a down and under and an up and out process of deeper inner investigation. The process itself, it includes these what would I call this? Like key ingredients, maybe. So it includes orienting for safety. It includes embodying your felt sensations. It includes naming and releasing our survival emotion. It includes mindful attunement. It includes somatic releasing, so not just emotional releasing, but body releasing. It includes identifying and naming your limiting beliefs. It includes reconnecting to your inner community. And it includes belief reprogramming and using Mind Movie as a tool to support that. It's been informed by pretty much all my teachers and my learnings. So it's been informed by performance psychology. It's been informed by a mentor of mine named Bonnie Badenoch. For those of you who don't know her, she has written a book called Being a Brainwise Therapist. It's informed by Gabor Mate's work, Dr. Jane Symington's work, interpersonal neurobiology, Joe Dispenza's work, Peter Levine's work, ACT, acceptance commitment therapy, Byron Katie and the work, Vanderkolk's Your Body Keeps the Score, Ian McGilchrist's work on the divided brain, or what did he call? Anyways, Bruce Lipton's work, The Biology of Belief, polyvagal theory, EMDR, and a colleague of mine's theoretical framework called bioemotive therapy. So that's what's informed kind of like, I guess, the thinkers behind the work. And this is my lovely creative chaos that represents my point of view that really supports what's behind the Flowing Fears process. So first of all, we have breath is our friend. So very much the process itself can't be effective if we can't stay attuned to our breath and our body. It requires mindful attunement. And so the belief that bringing mindful attention to our inner and outer environment helps us create that transformational change. It is also supported by the belief that non-resistance and surrendering to what is key, as well as radical acceptance of what is. So being with reality itself as it's unfolding in that moment. As well, a deep belief of trusting in the process. And those of you probably who've heard this term about trusting the inner intelligence, same idea. It's also supported by the belief that we are interconnected, deeply interconnected to our natural world, to the nature around us, that we are not separate from it. It's also supported by the belief that we are held within a field of love, and that healing, along with birthing and along with dying, occur in a non ordinary state of consciousness. So, those are the high level points of views that support the flowing fears process. So, I just want to acknowledge that we are at 3 p.m. and we started at about 2:05. So, we've been going for about 55 minutes. And I have we're almost done. I have about 7 more slides. So for those of you who have to pop off at the hour mark, you're welcome to do so now. And I just want to say thank you so much for coming. And you can watch the remaining. You're going to get a replay. But for those of you who can stay, I would love it if you would stay to the end. That would be wonderful. And I would just love to have like a final check-in and after the Q&A so that we can all say goodbye. So just want to acknowledge time here. So let's talk a bit about the role of the Flowing Fears Guide as I've come to understand. I believe that a Flowing Fears Guide, they trust in their client's internal system to reveal what is true in that moment. They don't tell their clients how to feel or what to think. They walk alongside their client and they hold steady. They seek to unfold each step of the process with mindful attention and attunement. They act as a safe anchor, using the principles of co regulation. They seek to cultivate relational safety. They see the other side of the ordeal. What I mean by that is they know and believe and have walked the path, and they can hold that for their client. And they actively engage in their own inner work. So let's quickly unpack the phases. So I've put it in 6 phases and 10 steps. And really, each phase is what I would see as the embodied system. Sorry, all 6 phases together represent the embodied system. So phase 1 looks at the situation and safety. Phase 2 orients towards the body. Phase 3 moves towards the mind and the cognitions. Phase 4 moves into the soul territory and the inner parts work. Phase 5 moves into heart and emotional releasing. And phase 6 is the state of coherence, which we know the state of coherence is what gives rise to mental and emotional well being. Coherence being that state of harmony, the harmonious flow of energy and information exchange. So here is my creative way of outlining all 10 steps with each phase. So this might look very overwhelming, but I will walk through it. And again, this is just an overview webinar. So of course, we're not going to go deep into each step, but just to give you a sense of it, I'm sure for some of you, this might feel very familiar. But first of all, we start down here. I don't know if you can see that when I do that. So at the bottom there, phase 1, the situation and safety. Notice a name is step 1. Step 2 is scan. So what do I mean by that? Notice a name is, first of all, we notice that we're in a state of resistance. We're in a state of activation. We're in a state of trigger, and we name it. Now, we could talk about being in a psychedelic session. We might not be able to do that, but as the process itself, as a standalone process, this first phase is notice and name. Step is notice and name. Then we scan for safety. So this comes out of this somatic experiencing work. We want to be able to orient in our environment and in our space to know that in this moment, in this place, with these people or without these people, that we are safe. So we're scanning using different somatic tools to orient towards safety. So we can't turn our attention inwards to focus on our inner experience if within our outer experience we are neuroceiving that there is risk or that there is a threat. So this phase one, we can't move to phase two until phase one is solid. So phase two orients towards the body. This is where we drop in and we experience felt sensation and we name the survival emotion. And to make it very easy, I know there's a lot of debate on this, but I align with more of the bio-emotive framework, which is that foundationally we have only a small handful of survival emotions: fear, anger, sadness, and then joy is our thriving emotion. So we're naming the survival emotion and we're naming and experiencing the felt sensation. So this is that mindful attunement to that inner embodied experience. From that place, we hold attention there and we move into phase three, which is the mind, the cognition. So we're going to bring awareness to now question one, two, and three. So there are distinct questions that are asked. They're the same questions that are asked each time. And they actually bring us deeper and deeper and deeper into identifying our core fear and identifying our core limiting belief. The idea here is that we don't shift away from the body into the mind. The idea is we stay with the body and then we notice what's arising from within. And I help my clients understand the difference between thinking and analyzing and observing and hearing. So we're hearing and holding question one, two, and three. Phase four, we go into the familiar past. So, for those of you who are trained in EMDR therapy, this might be familiar to you, or those of you who maybe have IFS training, this also might be familiar for you. Bonnie Badenoch called it your inner community. I love that term. So, this is based on the idea that we have a very vibrant, dynamic inner world that consists of our inner parts that make up our inner community. And so, when we're experiencing these felt sensations, these emotions, and those stressful thoughts, they are familiar. And 100% of the time, when I ask my client, is this familiar? The answer is yes. And then we float back along that familiar timeline to a time early in our life where we might have felt something familiar. So that's very EMDR. And that makes sense because I had done so much EMDR and had trained in it. It makes sense that this would have come out during my download. So we go back into the familiar past. Again, key here, we're staying with the co-regulated state of client and therapist and or guide. And then we're also staying with the body. So if at any point at this stage, the client pops out and is no longer in the body, then we go back and we titrate. But phase four is that we start to do inner parts work or inner soul work, whatever term aligns with my client. We retrieve that lost soul part, we reconnect, and we also replace the core limiting belief that that part was holding with a belief that's more true. And every single time, it arises from the heart and it arises from a place of compassion. I am never telling my client what to think, nor am I nor are they seeking outside of themselves to find out what to believe about that part. It just naturally arises from a place of love because we have moved the survival emotion and the heart then opens. So from there, we move into that heart space that I was just explaining. And then we move into phase six, which is coherence. And in this phase, this is kind of the phase I love the most because this is what I found was missing from a lot of the trauma modalities that I was working with. A lot of modalities and my experience with my clients is we would go down and under, but we wouldn't come up and out. And so we would keep deep diving, deep diving, deep diving. And I'm like, this never ends, even in my own life. And so this is where Joe Dispenza's material. For those of you who don't know Dr. Joe Dispenza, Google him, watch some of his stuff. For those of you who do follow Joe Dispenza's work, I've been following his work since the early 2000s when he came out with when he was in that movie, What the Bleep Do We Know? So I love his work. And I wanted a way to include it in the work that I do with trauma recovery. And I see now how this could be very useful for psychedelic integration. And so, this phase six is actually using the power of the mind with now a system that is cleared from all of that stuck survival emotion. We've got a coherent system, and we now move towards the belief that we want to believe and what we want to embody, and we envision ourselves in that new state of being. So we close with that new vision. These are the 10 steps. It is step by step. We can't actually jump each step. And it unfolded this way instinctively during that time that I was explaining to you. And I've now been working with it for the past 7 years with, and very, very much over the past 3 years with all of my clients. If if they're ready for it, that is. Okay, moving on. So here is just one quote from a client testimonial that spoke about the process itself, saying that Jennifer did a phenomenal job at bringing me into the moment. Then it was a straight arrow right into the heart of my messy matter and led me into my stuck lineage patterning and through to the other side into my greater understanding and deep felt healing in 57 minutes. So, although those steps might seem complicated at first, I can take a client through that in 30 minutes. So, this is something that we could easily include in those preparation and integration sessions. So, coming to a close, what is it that I want to say? So, first of all, one of my motivating points of view is that I believe that as humans, we hold a blueprint to not only heal, but to flourish and thrive. And although there are many factors that can interrupt the process of the unfoldment of our unique blueprint to thrive, such as trauma and prolonged survival stress, that, sorry, what was I wanting to say? That trauma and prolonged survival stress is a real interrupter of this natural state. See, that's the problem when you read sometimes. So, to turn this ship around and to uncouple it from the impact of trauma and survival stress, we need to be willing and brave enough to do the individual and the collective work that is required to free our system from being bound by survival emotions. And I believe that the blueprint exists because it exists in nature. And as a biological organism, we are interconnected with the natural world, which holds a different kind of intelligence, separate from our skull brains. And as an interconnected being, we thrive collectively. We grieve collectively. We suffer collectively. We heal collectively. And yes, we flourish collectively. So, this is a great paradox because we're doing this collectively, but it also requires the effort of the individual. So, why do I think the flowing fears process is a powerful modality for psychedelic integration and preparation, and even maybe during psychedelics? I'm not sure during the actual experience, but for sure, preparation and integration is to help our clients break free from those holding patterns, to work deeply during an integration session, to provide support during the preparation phase, and to help facilitate the transformational change. So here are some next steps. In closing, I don't have it yet, so this is preliminary. As I mentioned before, this is still my first run with this webinar. But I am putting together a training. My hope is to mentor and train other guides or therapists in the Flowing Fears process itself, and that would start in February 2024. So that is kind of the high level offering, and my large intention is to be able to support more of us to embody this skill, both for ourselves personally and to share it with others. There's also opportunity to work with me one-on-one. And you also then get the audio course. So the audio course is something I've already created, and it goes through each step along with guided processes and a workbook. You can refer clients. my way, and or we can chat about partnerships and or hosting this workshop or webinar. Whoop. And so finally, here's a list of some of my links where you can find me. You will receive this in a follow-up email, so don't worry about taking a screenshot or anything like that. I'm going to send out an email after this webinar, so you will get access to these links directly. And this brings me to close, which is not bad, an hour and 15 minutes. So now I just want to open up to any questions or comments in the chat before we close for real. Again, thanks everyone.